Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mindset Heartset Reset. I am super excited to welcome you. If you're coming in live or if you're listening to the recording, welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so excited to start you on another amazing episode of Mindset Heartset Reset. Mindset Heartset Reset is a dynamic live weekly show that provokes introspection, cultivates compassion, and sparks positive change. Through insightful discussions, practical tools, and authentic stories, this show nurtures empowering mindsets, open heart connections, and the courage to hit the reset button on our lives. Our mission is to expand love on a global scale with a vision to shift humanity's future into one in which all thrive. I am your host, Dr. Roshana Kashmian, a credentialed clinical, computational, and behavioral neuroscientist. My work is in optimization. As a consultant and advisor, I help people and businesses get to better, to elevate to the highest, most successful version of themselves. And today, I'm continuing our series on mental health with our amazing guest, Nidhi Tewari. Well, welcome, Nidhi, in just a moment. I want to tell you a little bit about her first. So we're really excited to talk about mental health, continuing on with the mental health in conjunction with Mental Health Awareness Month, this month of May. But it's really important to understand mental health because, well, it encompasses everything that we're doing emotionally, psychologically. It's important for our social well-being, and it relates to how we handle our relationships with others, how we make our decisions, how we manage stress. And it's really, as we talk about mental health, what we're talking about, and in particular today, is about awareness and understanding our own mental health so that we can manage and modulate our behaviors, our emotions, and make informed decisions that really enhance our overall well-being and our quality of life. So today we are talking about Echoes of Unrest, trauma in turbulent times. I'm very excited to bring this show to you because we today recognize how we are affected by all that's been going on: the pandemic, war, unchecked authority, excessive force, brutality, censorship. Our world feels unsafe, and it is taking a toll on our mental health. And so today we're going to be talking about what it means. What does trauma mean? What does it mean for us and for others? If we're feeling off, if we're feeling quickly triggered, quick to get angry, more fearful, more anxious, etc., then right now, joining us, our expert on mental resilience and trauma is Nidhi Tewari. Then we can help to demystify this complex world of trauma and really to help share the awareness of what it is and how it affects our brain, body, and psyche. So we'll learn about that. And we'll also start talking about vicarious trauma, because today we are so connected, right? Through social media, through internet, through our phones, video, etc. Although today my video's off. But that leaves a profound impact on us because we are so immediately exposed to other people's experiences. And we're going to learn what effect that has on our bodies, brains, and psyches. We're also going to talk a little bit about social media and technology and how those can contribute not only to this vicarious trauma and to our responses, but also how it can help us to manage and to connect with others in order to mitigate events and prevent them from becoming overwhelming, that can help us to cope. And finally, we'll talk about the strategies and what are the different ways that we might be able to manage these events, manage the stressors, manage trauma, and reclaim our mental well-being. So please join me in welcoming Nidhi Tewari. I'm super excited to have her here with us, and I'll tell you a little bit about her bio as soon as we give her a chance to say hello.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation, and I think that this is more pertinent than ever before. So I'm looking forward to diving in.
Super excited to have you join us, Nidhi. Thank you for accepting the invitation. So Nidhi is an LCSW mental health, that's a licensed social worker. She works in neurodiversity and is a resilience keynote speaker, expert, and consultant. She brings a decade of clinical experience as a therapist who specialized in working with high-performing leaders to her work with organizations, leadership teams, and event audiences who are looking to improve belonging, well-being, and leadership skills. Nidhi was invited to lead a session on resilience at TED Women 2023, and she's helped to transform workplace culture with organizations like Godiva, NPR, and McCain Foods. She's spoken to the World Economic Forum with Female Quotient, Society for Human Resource Management, National Speakers Association, Meeting Professionals International World Education Congress 2023, UC San Diego, American Society for Quality, and many more. She's been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, the Washington Post, TED Blog, Oprah Daily, Thrive Global, and Huffington Post. She's collaborated on brand partnerships with Mars, Inc., Adobe Express, Social Chain, Together, and many others. And so we really have an expert with us here today to help us to understand, speak to, and manage mental health stressors and trauma. So welcome, Nidhi. Thank you so much again for joining us. I'm going to start right off by asking you if you might please give us a basic understanding of trauma. What is the definition of trauma? Help us to understand whether trauma is related to events or experience, and let's go from there.
Sure. So I think when we often hear the word trauma, we assume that we're talking about war, natural disasters, abuse, things of that nature. And those are, of course, traumatic experiences. But if we really look at what the definition of trauma is, it's anything that overwhelms the nervous system's capacity to cope. And that can be an entire spectrum of experiences that people may go through in their life. For example, many people have experienced workplace bullying. That can be considered a form of trauma, depending on how it affected the person after the fact. Some people have traumatic divorces where they're quite contentious, and there's this battle between the two partners trying to figure out where the kids are going to go and how are they splitting assets. These types of experiences that we traditionally wouldn't think of as being traumatic, depending on how they're experienced by the individual, can very much be traumatic. And so I want to ensure that people are not looking at trauma through such a narrow, myopic lens, as we're often taught that that's the case. And we discredit and gaslight our own experiences where we may be struggling because it doesn't fit that formal definition of trauma. Trauma isn't also about the event itself. It's actually about the experience after the event. So a lot of people, like I said, think about it as specific to the event, but it's more about how did you respond? Are you having trauma reactions like avoidance? Are you feeling on edge? Do you struggle with your mood? Are you anxious, shut down? Do you find yourself having nightmares and flashbacks? These are all symptoms that you may be experiencing trauma or PTSD after an event occurs. But it's important to delineate that it's not actually about the event itself. It's about our physiological and emotional response after an event occurs.
Sorry, I was still muted. I love that. Okay, so we now have established that trauma is not necessarily an extreme event like war or assault or something like this, although, of course, those fall into the realm of trauma. We've typically, I think the average person typically has thought of trauma as something like this, which is why they felt that perhaps they have not experienced trauma. But if we start to understand trauma now as something that just makes us feel overwhelmed, as something that challenges our ability to cope with it, from there, help us to understand that as an experience, right? How can we differentiate between like everyday stress that maybe could, in the moment, help, have us feel like, oh, I can't manage this. I feel a little overwhelmed, and what would be considered traumatic?
Sure. I think that trauma has longer term reverberations. So when we think about our daily stressors, we're able to bounce back after a day or two. You have a difficult time at work, or somebody in your family gets sick and you're having to manage that stress. There's a timeline, there's a there's a limitation in terms of how long and prolonged that stress is. But when we're dealing with something traumatic, no matter how much you try to cope and navigate it, it's a physiological response. And so when you're faced with triggers, when you're faced with situations that remind you of the traumatic experience, it puts you right back into the throes of that initial experience of trauma. And so I think that, when we look at our everyday stressors, there's an ability to bounce back a little bit more readily from that. But when I think about somebody who's experienced something traumatic, it's quite debilitating to them. They're not able to bounce back. And those struggles are much more prolonged than what we would see from your typical day-to-day stress. Now, that's not to say that if you're caregiving for a parent, for example, who's sick and has dementia or is struggling with cancer or whatever the case may be, that can't be experienced as traumatic. But once again, we're looking at how is it affecting your functioning? And is this occurring over a period of time of 6 months, a year, where no matter what you do to try to cope emotionally, individually, you're not able to bounce back in the way that you would if you were just dealing with regular day-to-day stress?
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so now the question becomes, as we start to experience trauma, can you help us to understand what's happening within us that's making us feel that there's something a little bit more than just managing the stress? There is this longer term, as you said, physiological response, and there's also neurobiological uh, aspect to this. But we can feel things in our body. So let me just back up for a second. Trauma, obviously, must occur after we receive some input into the body. That means we see something, we feel something, we hear something, right? So it comes through our senses. That's an external to internal. But then as our senses are processing what's happening, something changes within us, in our body, in our physiology. Help us to understand what's happening within us that we could maybe now say, oh, this is an awareness of my body that helps me to figure out that I've moved in from just everyday stressors and just managing everyday life to a place where I am feeling or potentially experiencing trauma. In other words, trauma is an experience, not the event. What is my experience? And of course, everyone's going to be individual and different, but by and large, what are the general markers that we would look for that would help us to understand that our bodies are experiencing trauma?
There's a couple of things to be looking out for. One piece of this is that the trauma that's stored in our bodies is often resulting from thwarted survival responses. So take, for example, a moment where perhaps somebody is being robbed, okay? And your instinct in that moment is to try to fight back. But because they have a weapon, you are not able to fight back in the way that your body is desiring to do so. That survival response then gets stored in your body. It gets trapped in the body, and it creates both emotional and physical symptoms. Like a lot of clients I've worked with who have had these types of thwarted survival responses experience headaches, stomach aches, body tension, inflammation, a lot of inflammatory diseases like fibromyalgia, right? They actually can result from trauma being stored in our bodies that couldn't have been released in that moment. And so that's typically how it's going to show up. So the first piece of this is that we have responses that are innate to us. And when we're in a moment where we are not safe to react in the way that our minds and bodies need to feel safe and to feel like we can protect ourselves, that gets trapped in our bodies. The second piece is that we have 4 different responses that we go through when we experience something that is scary, that creates a lack of safety. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this. We go through either fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. Now, fight is your body's desire to want to literally fight back. And this can show up as agitation when it gets stored in our bodies and it's not able to be released. So we might have more of a hairpin trigger where something sets us off and we escalate very rapidly. That's a sign that maybe you have a fight response that was unable to be expressed in the moment of trauma. Some people have a flight response, and this can show up as avoidance. In the moment of trauma, you may have desired to run away, but you weren't able to. Maybe you had to hide instead. Maybe it wasn't safe for you to run. Maybe you were literally being pinned down by somebody, so it wasn't possible for you to escape. That then gets stored in your body. And that can show up as avoidance. It can show up emotionally as trying to escape from things that are overwhelming and stressful, which unfortunately, what we don't feel, we don't heal. And so then that also gets stored in our bodies. We have fawn, which is our desire to want to please. And in some cases, especially when I've worked with people that are survivors of childhood abuse, they had to fawn as a way to survive in their day-to-day lives. If you had a parent or a caregiver who was scary towards you, and the only way that you could survive was by staying in line, following exactly what they asked you to do, you are likely a fawner. And that often will show up as people continuing to abandon their own needs, people please, and really struggle with being able to acknowledge what they desire in a situation. And then the last is freeze. And this is where, in a moment of overwhelm and feeling unsafe, that you quite literally freeze. And this actually is quite a normal response. People feel a lot of shame about the fact that they couldn't react in that moment, but it's your brain and your body's way of trying to protect you and keep you safe. And so how this shows up in the present day is that people tend to be shut down. They tend to often, be hypo aroused, meaning that they, aren't reactive to things. They kind of have a more depressed presentation. And that's typically how that's going to show up in the here and now. So I share all of this because we have to think back to what happened in that moment of fear, of feeling unsafe. And if you really look at how you're moving through the world in the here and now, there's a lot of commonality between what you're struggling with now and what occurred in the past. And that, of course, is going to get stored both emotionally and physically.
I love that. So that brings us to two really important points. I'm going to see if my video will hold up for a second. One is the feeling safe. So how is it working for us? Or I want to bring forward the point that it's about feeling safe in our bodies. Because when we are in trauma, oops, I'm still freezing, so I'll be less distracting. I don't want to traumatize people. So when we are experiencing an event, then our bodies, as you were explaining, go into fight, flight, faint, fawn, or freeze. One of the things that becomes important is not a matter of feeling safe in the world, but feeling safe in our bodies, because our bodies are betraying us, as it were. They're actually being really honest, because what we haven't done is understood what the event was and how it affected us. The trauma stays with us as long as we haven't understood and addressed the process of feeling helpless, of what that did to our psyches, what that did to our brains, what that did to our bodies. And so that brings us to a second point. Number one is, now my body is in this state, but I'm not aware of it because I've sort of moved on as best I could. Especially in the West, we're not good at managing our feelings. We're not taught by anyone anyhow. What do we do? We're actually, the prevailing narrative is, if you feel bad, it's bad. Get past this as quickly as possible. And we don't want to get past things as quickly as possible. We want to process things so we can understand them, so we can resolve them, and they're not holding us prisoner. So trauma is, in a way, holding us prisoner, right? We are prisoners to the event in our bodies. That means two things. One, our body is stuck in a state. That's, as we know from the beautiful book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. So let's talk about that. And number two, and that feeling of, I'm not safe in my body. And the second thing of, and this is really important, and you touched upon this, we don't modulate well our responses when we're in trauma. And what that means, really, if we think about it, is we're stuck in the past. We're stuck in the moment of what happened to us, which is why we keep going back to it, which is why we are quickly triggered, which is why we go from 0 to 60 in no time at all. we're not modulating our response as well because we're not in the present, we're in the past. So if you could speak a little bit to what it means to us to be stuck in our body and to not feel safe in our body and to be stuck in the past, and how we might start to understand that, and then we'll move forward in what we might do to manage that.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people, you put it so well that we are stuck in the past and the past becomes present. So when we don't cope and deal with the things that have affected us in our past, in the previous times in our life, then of course it's going to show up relationally with people. It's going to show up in the way that we navigate stress, and it's actually quite a primal response. And I really think it's important to underscore that there are also brain changes that happen as a result of trauma. So if you find yourself reacting to a situation, being triggered by a situation, it's because your brain has quite literally changed after a traumatic experience. There's certain parts of your brain where its capacity is diminished. For example, the parts of your brain that are responsible for critical thinking, like your prefrontal cortex, that functioning is diminished a bit. So it's much more difficult to discern what is a real threat versus what is not a real threat. What's an appropriate response versus an inappropriate response. Your amygdala, which is basically your threat detection system. Think of it like an alarm system, right? If we have a car alarm system, we want it to go off when somebody's breaking in. If somebody shatters your driver's side window and is trying to steal your radio like they used to do back in like the 90s and 2000s, we want the car alarm to go off. But what happens after trauma is that now your car alarm is going off when somebody walks by your car. It's getting false input, and you're perceiving things to be much more threatening than what they are, which means that reactivity is there. So you react like a car alarm would, blaring, right? And then the last part of your brain that gets affected is the part that deals with memory, being able to store memories properly. And this is the hippocampus. This part of your brain, part of why the past becomes so present, is because traumatic memories don't get stored properly. All of that information, the images, the thoughts about yourself, the emotions, the body sensations, all of that gets stored improperly. And so it gets filed away in a way that it's way too easily retrievable. And when somebody is, like, say you're in an argument with your partner, it looks like, sounds like, and feels like it's your parent yelling at you and being aggressive towards you, like when you were growing up. So you react in a similar way. So I want to lay that out because I think there's a lot of shame that people feel around, gosh, like, why am I reacting in this way? I know better than that. Well, you can rationally know a lot of things, but your brain is perceiving it to be a certain way and your body is reacting in a particular way. So now let's move to the body piece. Yes, the body keeps the score, and your body is going to send physiological signs to your brain that lets it know that you are in a unsafe state. So that means that your heart rate's going to increase. You might notice that you perspire, your body gets really tense. You're preparing for fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? And so that's why, once again, we react so strongly. It's because your physiology is what drives your emotional responses, not the other way around. People think that they can think their way through a traumatic experience, that I can rationalize the way that I'm responding. But we have to understand that a calm body is what equals a calm mind. So we have to take the time to learn tools and skills to regulate our physiology so that then our emotional responses follow. Because if your brain is perceiving that something is threatening, if your body is feeling unsafe, then your emotional reactions are going to be in line with what those signals are that your brain and body are sending. So does that answer your question? I feel like, we have to kind of cover both the brain and the body piece because they both are very pertinent in terms of why we react versus respond.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you did it. You're such a rock star, Nidhi.
Thank you.
You are doing a beautiful job of, and this is a great talent of yours, of bringing to everyone in language they can understand, in simple terms, what is happening to them, with them. Now let's move on. Um, We have so much to cover in such a short time. So you've done a great job of helping us to understand the basics of trauma. We've been through COVID. We had a pandemic. We're in war after war. And we are now being inundated with images. Now we're getting into what if we were present. So we were present for the pandemic, right? And that had its own effect on us. Let's start with that first. But generally, our conversation is going to be about vicarious trauma. Can you help us understand how we are first? Okay, let me do it one at a time. I apologize. First, let's talk about this post COVID world and the experiences that we did have that we maybe just jumped right back in and said, okay, it's over. And as you were saying in the beginning, as we discussed, there hasn't been so much processing. Can you help us understand how we might be suffering now from what happened then?
The pandemic was a global trauma. It disrupted everybody's lives. We lost millions of people globally to this disease, right? And I think that the isolation, the lack of human connection, the difficulties that we all face. Many of us have had COVID, so now we're also studying and learning about the long-term impacts that we still quite don't have a grasp on. All of these pieces are very much they were experienced as traumatic, I would say, by most of us. Yet here we were itching to get back to normal, to normalcy, to being able to return to what was before. And what happened is that we never grieved, we never processed, we never took the time to really acknowledge what we had just survived. I think it's also important to recognize that when we're in the midst of trauma, we are in survival mode. So our brains and bodies take some time to catch up. And I think now in 2024, about a year and a half after we can finally say that this pandemic is better managed, and of course, COVID still exists, but it's not affecting us to the same degree that it was even in 2022, right? We still haven't really processed this. And so I think that it's really important for us to recognize that when we don't acknowledge and move through this survival state, when we don't come out the other side and then take scope of what's happened, all of that stress gets stored once again in our brains and in our bodies. And because we were in survival mode, we have this delayed effect. So many more people now are struggling with depression and anxiety and trauma responses. Many of us still are dealing with the after effects of not being able to socialize face to face, to have physical contact with people as we would pre 2020, right? And so if we don't start talking about this, I know we're tired and we're exhausted because our surge capacity has been depleted as a result of being in the midst of this for the last, it was like 2 or
Wait,
3
hold
years.
on. Could
Yeah.
you help people understand what surge capacity is, please?
Yeah, sure. So when we go through something stressful, even outside of the pandemic, when we experience something stressful, we have what's called a surge capacity. It's our ability to expand our capacity to deal with stress, right? And it has limits, but our brain works in a beautiful way of being able to stretch a little bit. Eventually, though, our capacity to cope gets taxed. And especially when you have prolonged stress like we did through the pandemic for the last 2 or 3 years, if you think about people that also have experienced maybe prolonged trauma in childhood, or an abusive relationship, or a divorce that went on for 3 or 4 years, a toxic workplace where you were stuck in it for 5 or 6 years, right? Our surge capacity gets depleted. And then that means that our ability to bounce back from those stressors is also depleted. So when we don't take a time to be able to replenish that surge capacity, well, then we end up being in a state of exhaustion, of fatigue. And I think that that's where we're at right now. That's why nobody wants to talk about this. Everybody's just like, oh, more COVID. Well, maybe a little bit. Maybe we need to talk about it a little bit. It doesn't have to be our primary focus like it was for the past 2 or 3 years. But I do think we need to acknowledge that we are more anxious than ever. We're more depressed than ever. And we're still dealing with the reverberations of a complete disruption to the world as we knew it. And our desire to go back to what we knew before is false too, because that world doesn't exist anymore, right? But our comfort was in 2019 before all of this happened. So there's so many layers to this, and I think that we're still dealing and grappling with the mental and physical impacts of those 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and it's funny. I remember when it was 2019 and everybody couldn't wait for 2020. And what did so we were already like maxed out, and then 2020 comes and hello, I'm a pandemic. So that was really we've been on a roll, and I think that we just sort of let our history go without realizing that this is just sort of like our drag force is increasing as we don't have time, as we don't pay attention to, as we think we've managed to get away from whatever it is that has been an issue for us, etc. We're like, okay, it's a new year, we'll just forget everything and we'll move on, right? So I love this. And people overestimate their willpower, right? Willpower is like a muscle, and it's been shown over and over again that we do, scientifically speaking, tend to overestimate our willpower and rely on that, and it gets exhausted like a muscle does, and we run out. And this is not the way to bootstrapping it is not going to work, right?
No, not at all. No, and resilience is actually about recognizing when you're approaching the limits and stopping. People think about marathon runners as just like go, go, go. Like they just push themselves to the limits. They push themselves after a race. They keep training, keep training. But when we really look at, for example, what Yale Health recommends for marathon runners, they tell marathon runners to take a rest. They say, please listen to what your body is communicating. Don't keep going because you will injure yourself. Pushing yourself to those limits, even in the context of a marathon, actually is traumatic on your body because you're pushing your body to its furthest limits. That means it needs time to recuperate. So you're exactly right. It's not about bootstrapping. It's about rest, and it's about recuperation.
And you know what? You're exactly right, because even from the Olympics, we know that when you're talking about training, because I work also in optimization, if there's what I call the power of the pause. If we don't take a rest, we are not optimizing for our performance and productivity. So there's also that false, like, give it 110%, which is exactly how you don't get the the highest level of productivity. And so not only does your productivity fall off, but you are suffering. And this is why you're not optimally productive in the brain and body and psyche, correct?
Exactly. You're exactly right on. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Let's quickly go through and talk about vicarious trauma and then get into how we might be able to manage these different traumas. So we've talked about what trauma is, how it's an experience as opposed to the event, how the body receives input and then responds to that input, and sometimes with a traumatic response. And one of the things we didn't talk about, and I want to talk about this actually before we move into vicarious trauma, is, and as we just finished talking about, COVID and the post-COVID world, what we know that trauma is our ability or lack thereof to cope with something. That trauma comes from feeling overwhelmed. Well, what is a great way for us to be able to prevent trauma? Support, social support, family support, etc. So I don't want us to, and I know we'll talk about that moving forward, but I don't want us to gloss over or not even mention the absolute fundamental importance of our environment to our experience. Would you please help us understand better the importance of our environment? And that means community, that means world, and that means, of course, friends and family, and sometimes strangers. And so that sort of brings us into the conversation about social media and how it can both, right now, we're going to talk about the aspect of how it can help us to manage. But after that, I'd like us to go into how it can also lead us into greater trauma. So first of all, help us understand how we can use friends, family, social media, etc., to prevent and address our experiences or our management of events, and also how COVID also affected that and is still moving forward, as we know, in our relationships, because things are not the same, are they?
No. Well, so the first piece, if I heard your question correctly, is about, how do we navigate trauma, and not glossing over the fact that trauma and resilience both are about aloneness and feeling connected, right? So
Yeah.
Gabor Mate talks a lot about how trauma is, once again, not about the event, but it's about the aloneness that we might feel as we navigate an event. And when we feel seen and heard by people, it reduces the impact of that trauma. And I truly believe that the key to resilience is not about your individual coping skills, though they help for sure, but it's about community. It's about your connections. It's about the quality of the connections, not just about how many people you know, but it's about your ability to be open and vulnerable and honest with people around you that you are struggling and that you are experiencing something that is overwhelming to your system. And that doesn't have to necessarily be an in-person relationship, which I think the pandemic was the perfect way of testing that theory, right? Here we were in a state where we couldn't even give hugs to our own family members. I didn't get to see my parents for like a whole year because they're elderly and I didn't want to get them sick, right? And I have asthma. But here I was developing these social and parasocial relationships online through Clubhouse, through Instagram, through LinkedIn, through all of these social platforms where, yeah, I didn't ever know a lot of these people. I haven't even met you in person, actually, Roshanak. Like we've
I
never
know.
met face to face, right? But there's a closeness, there's an understanding because we still saw each other and felt each other and were
We
able
had,
to feel
yeah, we
seen.
connected through conversation, through communication, through shared experiences, right?
Right, exactly. And so that's where the depth of a relationship, the quality of the relationship really matters. And yeah, and so that can be absolutely through your family, it can be through your friends. It can be as simple as being in a Facebook group that shares memes with each other. There's so many people that feel connected just by laughing at something alongside someone else and commenting on it and other people liking those comments or adding to the thread, right? It can be, your spiritual community, it could be your hobby groups, whatever that avenue is that you feel connected to other people. There's great value to that. And the perfect example of this is I worked with clients for a really long time. My specialty is in trauma, and I would work individually with these clients, and they would make such tremendous progress. But the theme that always came up with them is that they felt so alone in their experience.
Mhm.
And even though I understood their experience, as a clinician, I also have my own traumas. They didn't know that, but like I got it, but
Because
they
trauma is
still,
very common, isn't it? Let's just
it
talk about
is.
that.
Totally. It very much is. Many people don't recognize that they have gone through something traumatic. But I would go so far as to say, in our lifetimes, every single one of us will experience a trauma, whether it's a
I
car
totally
accident.
agree.
Yeah, whether it's grief and loss, which can be experienced as traumatic. I mean, it doesn't matter what the situation is, we will all go through it, right? And so these clients felt very alone. And we created a support group where they didn't ever talk about the trauma. That was actually a rule in the group. You're not allowed to mention your trauma. But it was understood that these 10 women in this group had experienced something similarly. And through the process of them being creative together, making music, going out into nature, learning mindfulness, they felt connected. And that was the missing piece of the equation for their healing. So we can't just focus on how do I cope individually. That'll get you to a point, but we have to look at how do we combine that with powerful relational experiences that can repair some of the damage and the harm that is done in the feelings of aloneness during the experience of trauma.
So, and we're going to talk about this. You say you can't just go through this individually. You also, it isn't always just talk therapy, right? So there are different therapeutic approaches, and everybody thinks that not everybody, that's silly for me to say that, but um, many people would think, like we said earlier, I'll bootstrap it. I can go it alone. I'll Dr. Google it. Whatever. I'll walk outside in nature, and walking outside in nature is very healing. But number one, going through it alone can only get you so far. And number two, as we know from the amygdala, okay, so the amygdala is, I'm going to pull a little neuroscience out, is in the subcortex, right? It's deeper down. When you look at the brain, it's deeper down into the brain. And so when we talk, we're connecting through these conscious areas of our brain. So the part of the brain that you look at when you see a brain, right? But the amygdala, which is one of the main things that the amygdala does is to be a threat detector. So when we talk about the amygdala when we talk about fear, but really it's talking about the most salient emotional experiences that we have. And so threat detection is really important for our survival, and the brain's job number one is our survival. So the amygdala is incredibly important at that. But it takes a lot longer for information to go through these conscious um, pathways, which is what happens when we're talking something out, than it does through somatic therapies that can then access the amygdala, which, depending upon what the state of the amygdala is, we might not be able to get to the amygdala in time, right? So there's a timing restriction because of the structure of the brain and the processes that are occurring. And so we're going to get into how talk therapy is great, but it's not a one size fits all, right?
Yeah, it can be very effective for other types of things. So, like if you're struggling with depression or anxiety, talk therapy can be helpful for those types of diagnoses. But for trauma, it tends to be less evidence based because so much of trauma is stored in the brain and the body. And so you need to be able to use somatic based interventions that really touch on resolving some of the memories that are stored and
Right.
reconsolidating those, as well as coping with the physiological responses.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about how we have a question, and the question is vulnerability a way to prevent trauma?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. Is it a way to prevent trauma? No, because I think that, once again, life is going to life, right? So, like, there's going to be
Right.
circumstances that are unfortunately going to overwhelm us, but can it reduce the impact of trauma? Absolutely. Absolutely. The caveat with vulnerability is I always tell people not everyone is entitled to hear your story. Not everybody deserves to hear your story. I think that it's important to be discerning with vulnerability because sometimes we're vulnerable with people who don't have the capacity to hold space for the vulnerability. And that can leave us feeling more alone than before, right? When you open up and then all of a sudden you feel like really icky and like, oh God, I made a mistake. Like I shouldn't have said that. It's because the other person was not giving you an attuned response. They weren't in tune with what you really needed. And
There's
so,
actually scientific studies that show that if we are feeling, in a negative state, let's say, I'm just using the term negative somewhat loosely, but when we're feeling bad and we talk to someone, a friend who quote unquote gets us, someone who is aligned and connected, then it shows that the activation, the impact in our body and our brain especially, is diminished tremendously. And we know that from our experience. I feel bad, I call you up, hey Nidhi, this is what happened, and you hold space for me and I feel better, or vice versa. But if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't get me, as it were, then I actually feel worse. So it's more damaging to speak to someone, to show that vulnerability to someone who doesn't make you feel safe, understood, where the communication has not been effective. Because communication isn't just throwing it, transfer of information, throwing out whatever's inside of you. Communication is an effective uh, transfer of information. That means what I've said, you got, and vice versa. And
mhm.
so when there is poor communication, it's actually much more damaging, as the studies show, than if we have. So that what you were saying about vulnerability, you can't blanket statement and say, yeah, go out there and be vulnerable to talk to everybody. It's a matter of being discerning and saying, this is where I feel, that I can share something, where I will have good communication, good connection. It all comes back to the idea of connection, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I always tell people that like communication and comprehension are two different things. You
Yeah.
can communicate with somebody and have that information exchange, as you said, but are they really feeling the empathy towards what you're saying? Are they really receiving what you're trying to communicate to them? Are they active listening? These are all going to be signs that somebody is able to hold space for your vulnerability. And one way to know whether that's this person is going to be the right fit for that is to just ensure that you test it with smaller things, like you share about a
Right.
smaller stressor, and if they can respond in an empathetic and compassionate way, then chances are they're going to respond in an attuned way later on as well.
I love that. And I love that you brought up empathy. And so many people think empathy is, can I feel what you feel? Whereas empathy is what you said earlier, the capacity to hold space for someone else, the capacity to allow someone to be themselves, which is also part and parcel of good communication skills, is, are you allowing someone to feel safe? And we go back to that word, to be able to express honestly what's going on. And that honesty is the vulnerability, because we're always so afraid of being judged. And we had this amazing show last week with Dr. Natalie Martinick, where we talked about shame, and trauma and shame are incredibly important and go together. And we also know that in the brain, so people have this expression, oh, kill them with kindness. Well, you could. I mean, literally, the brain changes in the face of this sort of shame that's related to trauma. That when you see in this, when you put someone in a scanner and they see a who's not in that shame trauma, that when they see a friendly face, you know, the prefrontal cortex parts of brain light up and become activated. And you ask the person, what do you see? And they're like, it's a friendly face, someone smiling, la, la, la. But then if you put someone who's in that shame state, that from that trauma, then not only does that area not light up, but other areas that are related to anxiety and immobilization become activated. So there are physiological changes, neurophysiological changes that occur in the brain depending upon what happened. And in particular, when there's, let's say, a betrayal by someone that you did trust, speaking of vulnerability, somebody, let's say like a parent that may have aggressed against you in such a way as to lead to trauma, then that kind, friendly face can be associated and become a trigger, as it were, with that event and bring you back. And this is what you talked about in the beginning. So empathy and kindness and what these words actually mean and how our bodies and our brains are reacting and responding. This is where some of that, those important bits of detailed information come in that make the difference from what the conversation you and I are having, from people who will throw out like a 20-second meme on Instagram and everyone thinks that they understand what's going on. And then I should be vulnerable, or I should just be kind, and then not understand truly that that can cause more harm than good. Or that empathy, for example, is that I can feel what you feel, and so therefore I must go into the state that you're in, which is absolutely not what empathy is, because that would be extremely destructive for everybody. That's like dragging someone down instead of throwing them a life raft or a life vest that would help bring them to safety, as opposed to pulling you down into the water with them, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that that is a great tie-in with social media, because we see so much pain and suffering happening. I mean, we have access to information so quickly, and it's easy to feel just hopeless. It's very easy to feel that way, because if you are expressing empathy or experiencing empathy, as in I literally feel the things that other people are feeling, that's not sustainable. You know, you can understand and support and be able to show up for a cause without sacrificing and abandoning your own emotional needs. And I think it's really important that we recognize that empathy, it's a skill that needs to be garnered and learned, but it does not require you to be in the trenches, quite literally, with others, right? I think that often we can express empathy and feel empathy and still have emotional boundaries that protect our own emotional state so we can sustain ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to get very burnt out on being empathetic, and we react in the opposite way, which is to withdraw, which is to put blinders on. And that's not healthy or helpful either.
Right. And so let's talk about, since we're talking about this, the vicarious trauma that can occur when, now we talked about it's not the event, but the experience. So, and we talked about how information comes in through our senses, our eyes, our ears, etc., our skin. And that is how the event is received by us, right? And now we have social media, now we have the internet, now we have videos, now we have everything right at our fingertips, and we are seeing in real time the horrors of war. I may not be in Russia, Ukraine, Israel, or Palestine, but I am experiencing what is happening through my eyes and ears, if not my skin, because I'm not physically there, but I'm receiving that input. Therefore, I am exposed to the event that can then become an overwhelming experience for me, something that makes me feel like I can't cope. And in particular, we see so much going on in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe, etc. So much of the world seems to be at war. There's so much injustice, and then there's censorship. If you're not, people feel that they're being censored. If I am on this side as opposed to that side, I'm not being heard. I'm being intentionally shut down. I'm being shadow banned, what have you. And so I would love for you to help us understand, because I think so many people, we have good hearts, we have good souls, we have good intentions, and we want to be supportive of human rights for all, of justice for all. And we are also at the same time these biological beings, that this engineering of this mortal organic machine has a tolerance window, right, of from here to there. And as you were talking before, how much can we hold our surge capacity, our cognitive resources, our ability to hold things within our brain and our body before we start to feel, and so many have, traumatized, and they didn't realize they were being traumatized because they're like, well, I'm sitting comfortably and I don't know, somewhere in the US. But having said that, and I'm not at a protest, let's say, I'm in my home, I'm in the comfort of my own home, in the safety of my own home. Why do I feel angry? Why do I feel so sad? Why do I feel so brokenhearted? Why do I feel so overwhelmed? Why do I feel so lethargic? Why am I, unable to modulate my responses? All of the hallmarks of trauma, although we are sitting at home. Help us to understand this vicarious trauma, please.
Trauma can be experienced even if you're not going through it firsthand. That's what vicarious trauma means. It's even just witnessing, hearing about really awful things can be traumatizing, because it once again overwhelms our capacity to cope. And when we're faced with bombardment, thing after thing, I mean, it feels like it's endless, right? There's just one crisis after another happening. Our ability
or simultaneously, even.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's like
where do I put my attention for all the injustices and all the pain that other humans are feeling, right?
Exactly. So we quite literally internalize that pain, and that can cause us to have our own reactions to it, right? Where we feel fatigued, we feel exhausted, we feel emotionally drained. Some people have had nightmares after viewing some of the footage coming out of all of the different regions that you just mentioned, Roshnak. And it's because, when our brains are perceiving in and taking in all this information, it's very overwhelming. We're seeing things that people are literally seeing in war zones, right? And we know that when soldiers and when people are in a war zone, they come back traumatized more often than not. So if we're seeing the same atrocities, why wouldn't we also feel traumatized seeing those same things, right? And so that's what vicarious trauma is that you don't have to go through it yourself. You don't have to be in Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Afghanistan. You don't have to be in those regions to experience similar types of reactions to the people that are there. And so how do we cope with this? Well, I think it's really important, one, to recognize that setting boundaries and limits in terms of your intake of that information does not mean that you are disengaged or that you don't care or that you're not invested in advocacy for all of those causes, right? I think it's important that we look at this as a marathon, not a sprint. These wars have been going on for centuries, honestly, and they're going to continue, unfortunately, to go on. And so we need to preserve some of our own resources so that we can continue to advocate and not burn ourselves out or become vicariously traumatized as a result of it. And so that might look like limiting the amount of news information that you're taking in. I did a digital detox this weekend because I was feeling overwhelmed with everything. And you can do things like that. And it does not mean that you're any less empathetic or caring or invested in these causes. And I think that there is a misconception that if you set up some of those boundaries, then you're turning the blind eye, that you're burying your head under the sand. But I think it's more about survival than it is about disengagement. You know what I mean? So I think that that's an important piece of it. And I think it's also important, as we talked about a little while ago, that A lot of trauma is about feeling alone in your experience. When you feel censored, we're taking away people's voices, and that leads to the feeling of disconnection and aloneness. So you want to find your circles of people where you can process and share what your internal experience has been. And that way, people are able to support you and show up for you, and you will feel less alone in your experience. That might be on social media as well, that you're able to connect with other people that are passionate and are, really on board for human rights advocacy. But be cautious, because, the internet also has people that are going to jump on you regardless of what view you express. And so that can also lead to you feeling more isolated and alone in your own experience. But we need to think outside of the box and create some boundaries and limitations around what we're willing to take in and how we're going to show empathy and care and what we're going to put out into the world.
I love that. I love that so much, because so many people feel guilty when they have to take care of themselves. And they're like, but if I do that digital detox, as you're saying, if I remove myself, then I have left others out. I have deserted humanity. And so we've got guilt and shame and trauma all wrapped up. And we're wondering why we're such a hot mess, why we're suffering so much, why we become lethargic, why, fill in the blanks, because we are just not as effective and we are in pain. And as I said in the beginning, our mental health, our emotional health that is connected to our relationships, our decision making, our productivity, our various dimensions of well-being, they're all being affected, and powerfully so. Okay, Nidhi, help us understand, what can we do to, in terms of addressing and managing this? Help us go through some of the therapeutic options. And in particular, I'm excited for you to tell us about something known as EMDR, and what EMDR stands for, and how it originally started as this sort of alternative, what is this woo-woo way of helping us, that is now absolutely understood as a fundamental, foundational way that is extremely effective in helping us manage trauma.
Yeah, EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is basically like a lot of jargon to say that that when a traumatic experience happens, memories get stored improperly. And part of being able to navigate and overcome trauma is helping to move those memories and those body sensations and the elements of an experience through, so that they can be stored in a proper way. That's really what EMDR does. It basically makes the past less present for you. And this started off, it's an intervention that was created by Dr. Francine Shapiro. She one day was out on a walk. She was having some distressing thoughts, and she was looking up at the trees and noticed that her eyes were going back and forth as a way to just think about and move through the experience. And as she moved her eyes back and forth, she noticed that the distress that she was feeling reduced. And she was like, that's really interesting. Like, I wonder what that's about. So she studied it and found out that the eye movements actually mimic our rapid eye movement sleep state, except in a fully awake, controlled, you're in full control manner. And it helps the memories to be able to be reprocessed. That's part of what your brain does when you're dreaming, right? Your dreams are your brain's way of taking information from throughout the day, stressors, experiences, and moving them through. And you wake up and you feel better after you have those dreams. Or if you have nightmares, it's because your brain is trying to work through the tough parts of it, right? So that's how the intervention got created. And 30 years later, here we are with this being the gold standard for trauma work, for trauma reprocessing. It's the most validated trauma intervention out there, and it's used by the Veterans Association, the VA. It's used by the World Health Organization. I mean, it's endorsed by a lot of major organizations. So it's powerful. And I personally not only am a clinician and a teacher of this intervention, but I have personally benefited from EMDR. When I was invited to attend TED in 2022 in Vancouver, it had been 10 years since I'd flown because I had had a traumatic experience on a plane, and the avoidance was strong. The panic was strong. And of course, I didn't want to turn down an opportunity to attend the place where they record the TED Talks. And so I was like, well, I got to figure this out. So I went to my own EMDR therapist. Within 6 sessions, I was able to get on a plane, and I have flown all over the world to speak, to Mexico, to Zurich, Vancouver, to Seattle, all over. have not had anxiety since. So it's very effective intervention. But there's other interventions too. You can use things like somatic experiencing, which really helps to move through some of the physiological body responses relating to trauma. There's internal family systems, which helps to deal with the fragmentation that happens after a traumatic experience and helps with reintegration of parts of self that, become protective and defensive as a result of trauma. So there's a multitude of different interventions out there that can be very helpful. The most important piece for people listening to look out for is that you need an intervention that's going to be dealing with not only just the cognitive aspects of trauma, the thinking aspects of trauma, but also the physiological pieces of it too.
I love that. So I know that you are on a tight schedule because you have patients. And we're so grateful that you spent the time with us. First of all, if you look, we have on the banner the 2 different ways that you can get in touch with Nidhi and invite her to come and speak at your events. Nidhi, you also have a practice. Could you tell us about that? And you're also on social media. So while we have the banners up for those who would like to invite you to speak and to connect with you on a higher through organizations and through giving talks, could you also tell us how the average speaker might connect with you as well, or if somebody wants to come and see you as a patient?
Yeah, absolutely. My talks are typically on resilience. They're typically on neurodiversity, neurodivergence. They're on helping to support mental health at work. So if you're interested, you can reach out through my speaking agency or my website. If people, I'm not really accepting new clients at this time. I've been full for the last 2 years, thankfully.
But you're that good.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thank you. EMDR is in high demand. So if you would like to learn more about the work that I do, you can go to Nidhi Tewari, lcsw.com. It's my name, lcsw.com. And you can learn more about EMDR. If you're an EMDR therapist, I do consultation. I am accepting some new consultees, so happy to talk with you if that is of interest. But really, at this stage, I'm looking to book more speaking engagements with corporations and events. So feel free to reach out to me and my speaking agency, and we'd love to connect.
We like to end every show, and there's Nidhi Tewari, lcsw.com. Everybody would like to connect there. And they can follow you on Twitter. They can follow you on Instagram. They can follow you on LinkedIn, right? They can connect with you through all those social media, right?
Yeah, LinkedIn is my primary platform right now. Instagram is a close second, TikTok as well. So feel free to follow me on any of those platforms. I put out a lot of mental health content, particularly mental health at work.
Excellent. So we like to end the show with the get off the couch moment. What is something that somebody who's listening can do right now to help them to move into protecting themselves, managing their emotions, managing events that could be overwhelming? What is it that somebody can do today to take care of themselves and their mental health with respect to the conversation that we've had?
I think the most important piece is to do a self-inventory. We move through our lives without even realizing that we're feeling overwhelmed because we're so disconnected from our own inner experiences. So slow down a little bit and just check in. How am I feeling? What's going on internally? Am I feeling overwhelmed? What do I need right now that I haven't been giving myself? That self-awareness is your first step to being able to reconnect to your mind and to your body and to get the help and the support that you deserve and that you may need.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us. Nidhi Tewari, you've been amazing. Nidhi Tewari, everybody. Remember that name. You have been very generous with your time and with your knowledge, and we really appreciate what you've brought to help us all heal in the world today. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you've joined us live and if you're joining us in the recording, go back and listen to this again and again and again, because there's so many amazing nuggets that are going to be extremely helpful and supportive as we're all of us managing the world together as a community. We last week, as I said, had Dr. Natalie Martinick speaking to shame. Next week, we've got Barry Lina Grant, who will be speaking to grief. And this this trifecta, this perfect storm of shame, trauma, and grief, I think are going to be incredibly important with these three incredible speakers to help us manage what we're going through today in a world that can feel overwhelming. So thank you for joining us. We're happy you connected with us. We're looking forward to connecting with you again next week on Mindset Heartset Reset on Tuesdays at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. Thank you again, Nidhi Tewari. God bless. Namaste, everybody.
Thank you.